Dear Spine community, I welcome you to our podcast series. Spine is the first global search engine focused on alternative healing, spirituality, and consciousness. Spine connects providers with seekers, and in this podcast, we introduce you to the people of the network, their stories, and their insights. I wish that Spine brings you a lot of inspiration in your life and perhaps also opens up many new paths for you. In this spirit, enjoy listening. Yours, Sylvia Leifert. My guest today is a truly profound and at the same time a globally open philosopher who spent many years in Vedic monasteries where he deeply immersed himself in both Indian and Western philosophies. He is a Veda ambassador and one of the most consistent thinkers of a spiritually holistic worldview. However, he is also a very meticulous and profound researcher exploring the links between consciousness, language, and cosmic interconnections. I've valued him for many, many years, and honestly, I'm also a really big fan of his unique way of seeing and describing the world because he somehow sweeps away the dust of old knowledge from the very roots of our being with a certain incorruptible clarity and genuine curiosity, I'd say. And it's always a real pleasure to listen to him speak. I'm especially looking forward to Armin Risi today. Hello?
Yes, wonderful. Thank you very much, Sylvia.
I'm happy that it worked out.
We've known each other for quite some time, and we just recalled it was 13 years ago back at Next World. We even met in person there for an interview, and now our paths cross again like this.
13 years later, what all hasn't changed? I would really like to, even though we had a wonderful conversation back then, but not everyone has seen this talk, I'd still like to introduce Armin a little more to the people of our community now. So let's delve a little into your story, which is indeed very, very exciting. So, where I want to begin is you broke off from the usual path as we know it of school. What were your reasons? What prompted you to go this way?
Yes, I took a somewhat unconventional educational path, though I naturally started it conventionally. I was in middle school on my way to university. But over the years, I simply felt that this wasn't my path, that the way how one is educated and molded there, that somehow it contradicted my true calling, my inner path, even though back then, at 17 or 18, I didn't exactly know yet what this inner path was. But various occasions and experiences truly led me to the point where I felt compelled to take this significant step that I then publicly declared my intention to leave school. Well, I didn't really know what was going to happen next. I just simply knew that I absolutely had to take that leap. And then somehow, after I had taken that crucial step, a brand new door suddenly opened up, one that I probably would have completely missed if I hadn't taken that initial step beforehand with a great deal of yes trust. It was precisely during this phase of detachment and letting go that I became acquainted with the Vedic, the Indian, the Sanskrit scriptures, and then practically from one day to the next I became a novice, a Krishna monk, and lived that way for 18 years. So that is naturally the most striking and defining aspect of my personal biography, that I lived as a monk for 18 years from the age of 18 right up until I was 36.
But it takes a certain special kind of energy, to be truly courageous enough to step away from that at such a young age. So did you have supporters or were you completely alone?
I was naturally, I almost wanted to say, completely alone. Of course, I couldn't talk to anyone about it. In school, that was naturally considered crazy or just plain weird. Afterwards, everyone said, now everything makes sense. He went and joined a cult. Then they had their neat little explanation. The world made sense to them again. But I was already gone in that sense. So my parents supported me in the sense that they understood me and essentially shielded me from all the criticism. That is truly astounding. And for that, I was always immensely grateful to them. You know, they didn't really completely grasp what it was I was trying to achieve or the exact reason why I was pursuing it, but they simply had an unwavering trust in me. It was as if their attitude was, you already know exactly what you're doing.
But why did the impulse come from you that it was actually heading towards India, or was that still initiated from somewhere else? Where did you come into contact with it?
It was actually, for me, more of a significant surprise because I had already developed this particular feeling quite early on. You know, somehow, even when I was just a very young child, I already had this distinct sense.
That's Steve Buffet, that what is happening here in this world is anything but normal.
And above all, the feeling that it wasn't always like this and won't always stay that way. It was somehow like a deep-seated feeling I had always carried with me, that the past holds essential keys for shaping our future. I read a lot when I was a child. I was a loner kid, but I didn't suffer from it. I was happy to be left alone. So I just had time for myself and could do whatever I wanted, whatever interested me. And I naturally read a lot, school books, the school library and all of it. I didn't feel confirmed there. I had a different perception of the great past. Not in that sense, not the last 102 or 500 years, but rather the very origin of humanity, as it were. So the grand historical arc. And that's when, as a 13-year-old, I just gave up, 2001. Exactly. Either everyone else is wrong and I'm right, or I'm wrong and everyone else is right. And I didn't dare to think that I was right and the others were wrong, so I thought, well, it must be the way everyone says. But then when I was about 17, 18 and I discovered the Indian scriptures, I suddenly realized that I wasn't alone here at all. This is a vast tradition of knowledge, a huge knowledge portal, so to speak, that also confirms in great detail what I had somehow intuitively felt. You see, I had no concrete images.
But when I read the Vedic scriptures, it suddenly became clear.
That's how I personally perceived it. And then it was, of course, very clear that I would just step in starting the very next day and then follow this particular path.
So you were living in a monastery at that point. How should we picture Armin's daily routine? What was a typical day like for him in such a monastery?
No, I was not actually in India. That's a common misunderstanding. I was an Indian monk, a Krishna monk, you know, the Hare Krishna movement. I was part of it, but it's truly traditional. From a classification standpoint, it's really Hindu. So one would have lived there in India exactly the same way I do here in the Western ashrams, just maybe a little bit harder, but in style, exactly the same. Proof pause. So you live as a monk, pause. You get up early in the morning, a pause. The program began around 4 a.m. From 4 to 9 in the morning, we were out and about, engaged in various segments, including meditation, singing, ceremonies, and communal scripture study. Yes, that's what it was. But the beautiful thing is, when one becomes a monk, this is not in the Catholic understanding. The wonderful thing about Indian food is, when you become a monk, you become a student monk or a novice monk, and there you decide for yourself how long you want to live that way. You live like the monks, observing celibacy and the vows and all that. But, you know, both men and women know that this is a choice they've made themselves, and there isn't that kind of psychological pressure. I have to make a decision now after 2 or 3 years of novitiate and introduction, and then I take my vows for the rest of my life. Just come and join us and begin to live. And the final vows, those would be taken much, much later. So the idea of a lifelong commitment, that particular step, it would only come much, much later. And most people, in fact, don't ever take that step. I, for example, obviously did not make that choice either. 18 years, that was already considered quite above average. Most people don't remain for such a long period of time. So it was no problem then when I decided to go my own way.
Speaking of going your own way, when did you start to feel that your own path was taking shape exactly as it is now? Or to put it differently, how did things progress from there? What was the impulse that led you from this kind of life to the next stage, to writing, to leaving your messages behind?
Yes, it is, you know. It's like a school, a proper school. I really did experience it as a school myself. So at a boarding school, you spend all 24 hours of the day there, but in a very positive sense. And the doors were always open and you could always leave. For a certain time, I even regretted leaving, thinking, I've been here so long, it's somehow a shame to go. But then it became clear because I had immersed myself deeply in these Sanskrit scriptures. It's a completely different way of thinking that the people there possess. It's not this logical, clearly articulated or fully formulated approach. It's much more mythical. The topics are explored spirally from various different perspectives, but not in a linear first, second, third, and fully elaborated manner.
It's simply a worldview, a comprehensive worldview that's imparted.
Also with mythical images and mythical stories. And my main objective was actually to logically translate this mythical knowledge
so that it becomes comprehensible for us. Pause, because many things are not explained, many things are simply assumed because they are self-evident. Pause. But for people like us, those living in modern times, it's not so self-evident. Pause. And that's why I simply did what was almost like foundational work, so that for me personally, when I was doing this,
I spent the majority of the time working there as a translator, so I was in my element. I could be in the books from morning until evening. I translated it from the Sanskrit scriptures, but from English into German.
I am not a Sanskrit scholar. Naturally, some Sanskrit knowledge remains with me, but I have not formally studied the Sanskrit language itself. That certainly would have been an option as well. But I decided to focus on translation and specifically concentrated on translating from English into German. So these were Sanskrit texts that had already been translated into English. And I then helped with the translation from English into German. And then naturally I had the full-time commitment to really dive in, to read everything systematically, each book repeatedly, because once you've read something a few times, you always interpret it differently. And that's just how things naturally evolved over the course of the years, leading me to begin to explain this internally in such a way. And that was also very well received. And then naturally the very first inquiry started. How should I put this? We have some requests. Would you mind writing that down for us? We would really like to read it in that specific form. And then they found an open door with me when this question was brought to my attention, because I had already been doing it privately. And then I began to formulate and elaborate on it. And that's how my first nonfiction books came into being. By now, I can proudly say that I just celebrated my 30th anniversary as a nonfiction author.
October 1995 when my very first nonfiction book was published, and now it's already 30 years later.
Yes.
So language is something that very, very quickly helped you to begin to see things from a completely different perspective, to make use of all these various things, this knowledge, energetics, and so forth. Has that transformed within you over time? Has anything truly evolved or significantly changed in the way you approached language when you first embarked on these studies compared to how you handle it currently?
Well, that naturally depends. Language is a carrier of information.
So this is simply the functional aspect of language. Pause. This is where information is articulated and then passed on. Pause. But language also possesses an energetic and then also a dimension connecting aspect. For me, literature and poetry were a very important starting point. When I sort of gave in around 13, relatively early, I somehow capitulated to the superior force. So, and that's where because I had read a great deal, not just about world history, the Second World War, but also specifically about American history, especially the war against the indigenous peoples there, how their land was taken from them and everything. That really shook me in a way and left me deeply affected.
And so when I was about 13 years old, I then also made the statement,
I am now an atheist. It was like better know God than a God like that. that wasn't fundamentalist atheism, but more of an idealistic atheism. Better no God than a God like that. But just a few years later, 3 years later, I was then in school, or rather we were in school, in middle school, in German class. We got to the time of classicism, and there, particularly Schiller, Friedrich Schiller and Friedrich Hölderlin. For me, those were like two, how should I put it, like guiding signals, like a series of wake-up calls. When I read that, my idealism was reawakened within me, and I simply refused to give up. I finally emerged from my self-imposed isolation. For many years, all my free time, which I used to spend devouring countless books, I then dedicated to reading only chess books. I taught myself chess, I trained myself in it, and I even made it into the higher ranks in the European junior leagues. But then at 17, I already stopped playing again. I had already made a decision to step down at 17, but that's because a whole new passion and a very different kind of love awakened in me at that time. Chess had always been a bit of a love-hate thing for me, so, well, yes, I guess. At 16, and then 2 years later, I was already a monk, a novice. And during that time, I read so very much and naturally opened up a whole new dimension. When you enter the thought worlds of these people, they weren't just poets. They didn't write to torment students 200 years later. They didn't write for German class. Or they're treated today like as if in a museum, a little compartment here, a little compartment there. But they had visions. They were intellectual revolutionaries. And they truly wanted nothing. They wanted, as Friedrich Hölderlin himself once famously said, he consistently maintained, even from his youth, saying, I believe in a future revolution of our mindsets and ways of thinking that will make everything that has come before blush with shame. When this revolution of attitudes and ways of thinking comes, as Friedrich Hölderlin wrote, then all our past actions will be made to blush with deep shame. We will be ashamed that we, in the name of God and in the name of science, that we believed such divisive and one-sided things. We're going to be quite ashamed of ourselves, and I believe we're well on our way to realizing that this is slowly becoming clear. Yes.
Well, the question of whether you believe his wish was ultimately fulfilled, I actually intended to ask a little later, but it fits quite perfectly right now.
What is the wish you mean?
The wish of Hölderlin, what he had formulated.
That doesn't really depend on me, you see.
Yeah, but what do you think from your own perspective? Is that something that's already happened or not yet?
For me personally, yes.
Uh-huh.
For me, you see, I went through this Western development in a kind of fast-forward school and all of it. I observed what was commonly believed there, and that actually led me into a state of resignation for a short period, because somehow the inner images and what I had intuitively perceived were not, they were simply presented as incorrect.
You have a completely wrong perception of the world, and
But then with the help of the Vedic traditions and the actual connection of the various spiritual cultures and diverse lines of knowledge, I believe I was truly able to achieve for myself a profound revolution in my attitudes and my ways of thinking. And that is not something completely, entirely new, but rather it is the timeless essence, it is the primordial wisdom of all humanity.
And when humanity drifts into such extremes, be it in the name of God or in the name of science, meaning materialism, then the timeless becomes revolutionary once again. But in reality, it has always been there.
Can one say that these individuals, like, for example, Hölderlin, Schiller and others, are indeed quite spiritual?
Who were spiritual and expressed this deep spirituality in their poetry?
yes, of course, everyone in their own way, right?
Schiller the realist, Hölderlin the visionary, Goethe the realistically idealistic. Every one of them has his own justification. I mean, when you consider it, Goethe was proven right. Things didn't progress as quickly as Hölderlin and Schiller had hoped. Therefore, Goethe was truly realistic. He had a very clear understanding, and he saw
Mephistopheles will first make himself quite at home.
So even broader, he was already quite widespread back then, but he will gain a much greater influence. Goethe then demonstrated in Faust in a very astonishing way how that works.
Everyone just goes about it their own way again.
But
Precisely the artistic aspect
had the assignment to do.
The poet's profession.
I'm now talking about idealism as a philosophical direction, not just idealistic, meaning naive. I just believe in ideals, so that's the common usage of the word idealistic. But idealism means mind over matter. First there is the idea, then the spiritual realm, and from this spiritual essence, matter subsequently manifests. This applies to the process of cognition, but also from a creation standpoint. The subtle worlds existed first, the higher planes, the very worlds of ideas, just as Plato once described them. But the word idea itself is also something completely different from what we understand as idea today. You know, like, do you have an idea? Or I've got an idea. It's simply, usually it's some kind of mental construct, a thought or a concept that gets described as an idea. However, the Platonic word idea actually means the beheld or the seen.
The word idea in Greek actually shares the very same linguistic root as the Sanskrit word Veda, by the way, doesn't it?
Veda comes from vid, meaning to see, and videre in Latin, so it's all about seeing, observing, and then idea is what has been seen, and also that which is yet to be seen, provided one opens up the appropriate horizon. So Plato's
The doctrine of ideas was a Vedic doctrine, a Veda doctrine, both directly and also etymologically. And idealism means one understands that everything comes from the spiritual into matter, and the artist, female artist, music, images, painting, writing, poetry, words, and sound. It doesn't always have to be solely about words, but art, as we know, is the overarching term for all of these expressions, and it has the mission and the task to make that which is not directly perceptible, visible, or audible become visible, perceptible, and comprehensible to people. This is achieved through poems, through various sounds, through spoken words, or indeed through musical compositions or written texts. In these realms, the invisible is made visible, and a path is prepared for humanity. That is also the legitimization of the poet or the artist. An artist is not a parasite. An artist has a crucial task, namely this connection of worlds.
He is ultimately a kind of medium. I completely agree with you on that, and I've always been a strong advocate that ultimately many artists are indeed very spiritual without directly naming it as such. By the way, for me, after my near-death experience, I had one of the first inspirations because you were just talking about ideas. I also find the word inspiration very, very fitting because it feels like it falls from above. I've never had anything to do with it, I say quite honestly, but suddenly a poem wrote itself through me. But I have kept it with me even to this very day. Among my works, it's always one of the initial pieces that are documented. I didn't pursue this subject any further, but I know for certain that it definitely originated from something entirely different, from something much grander, which I had not previously contemplated, acknowledged, or even truly recognized.
And now, let's talk about you for a moment. You write poems as well, don't you?
You also have a very poetic way about you. What do you believe is your source for that? And when did you truly, for the very first time, independently experience that spark of God or the spark of the Spirit?
Yes, exactly. When I read about the great role models, the ones who came before me, it was just like love at first sight, like a moment of true recognition. Most people groaned about it when they were in school.
But for me, it was really something like
It was simply a great inspiration, a true source of joy. I would read poems there, and above all, Schiller's plays, just like others would read comic books.
Well, I have Mary Stuart and William Tell anyway, and The Maid of Orleans, and the others are just there.
all of this, within just a few weeks, I had managed to read through it completely. I finally had some free time again. I wasn't studying any more chess books, so I had the time again to really dive deep into entire series for hours on end, and that naturally had a huge, well, it also opened up a source within me. And so already as a 16, 17-year-old, I was writing. I even wrote a 5-act play in blank verse, very much in the style of Schiller. I even quite optimistically sent it to the Lucerne City Theatre. They then sent it back a bit confused because it wasn't suitable for their program. But that was perhaps a little bit anachronistic. It didn't quite fit the prevailing spirit of the times, but I'm actually quite glad that they didn't accept it. Otherwise, who knows where I would have gotten stuck, but simply it then opened up my inner dialogue. And when you engage in creative work, you have an inner dialogue. And that also provides an inner mental space, which then gave me the strength to go the way I eventually went, or to take that specific step. That was my stopping point. That doesn't mean the other path would be any less good. But for me, it was the right call to step off there and travel a bit on parallel tracks.
What I'm trying to get at is that you've just recently published a new work. It's titled Soul Path Images. Could you tell us a little bit about what's moved you to bring poetry back to the forefront and elevate it even more now? What was your motivation for that exactly?
And that's exactly right, yes. With Caspar David Friedrich on the front, wandering above the sea of fog. But it naturally fits the soul's journey imagery so well because the fog also represents the unconscious. Where we're just about to go down now. This hiker certainly won't stay up here. He's going back down there. That's where he came from, and that's exactly where he'll return. He's heading back into the valley. So we're diving into the mists and then the deeper, more profound parts into the subconscious, or what truly moves us there, what really touches us. That is precisely this painter. Many artists worked in that style, but he, above all, Caspar David Friedrich, is indeed very well known for these truly profound paintings. On the surface, you only see nature and some ruins, but it is precisely there that these also become intuitive gateways into a higher perception, beyond the facade of matter.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
My first 3 books were poetry volumes, but that was already 30 to 33 years ago when I wrote them. And then I dove deep into nonfiction, but somehow last year I started rereading my early works. And I then really immersed myself in it again. Back then at the monastery, I had written them quite quickly. Not so refined. Now it was like somehow it became so compelling that I really take the time to properly elaborate on it literarily. Well, that whole thing was still somewhat unresolved, but now it's finally been brought to a close. It is, what can I really say? It's simply a personal vision or a personal feeling that if you have something, if it's expressed in a literary or artistic way or takes on an artistic form, then that is also a significant first step towards its materialization. Then it has truly arrived and settled within the morphogenetic field, and from that point it can continue to radiate outwards. And then others in turn, and you receive these inspirations themselves, and they pick up right where others have left off, and that's how it continues from one generation to the next.
Ultimately, these kinds of word formations truly build bridges into the subtle, ethereal world. You are also a very strong proponent of the idea that this truly possesses profound metaphysical power. These words, the precise way they are shaped and the specific rhythm, the very cadence in which they are formed. Have you also had some very unique experiences in meditations, perhaps with language? I'm sure I'm thinking now with your contact with India and Indian Vedas. How is that?
Would you mind describing for me how you perceive language energetically?
Naturally, for example, practically all of the mantras,
prayers and mantras are, essentially verses.
They are indeed composed in a literary style with a certain rhythm.
That, of course, has very specific and concrete reasons because they are also intended for recitation, and that's why it possesses a very distinct rhythm. And rhythm is, after all, there is always a form, and there is always both form and content. The content is naturally important, but every piece of content also requires a suitable form.
I mean, the entire universe is a form, the galaxies are a form and shape themselves in sacred geometry or holy geometry, and that's why especially the ancient poets, who were always also singers, performers,
they have developed a very strong liking for it.
Their content was then infused into a formal language, which is to say a language that possesses a very distinct rhythm. Because by the fact that man voluntarily, as it were, places himself into a certain form, he acknowledges, and through this he also expresses that he, the divine order, which is already present,
that is fundamental to the entire cosmos, to all creation, to everything.
He expresses the fundamental truth that we, as human beings, are inherently destined to live in harmony with this divine order, and the artist, of course, is the one who brings this profound truth to expression.
Naturally, modern art today is quite the opposite, where people somehow, perhaps from sheer frustration or resignation, say that it ultimately accomplished nothing. They created all of this art 200 or 300 years back, and it brought no real change. So now people just go to the existentialist or expressionist extreme, and art must depict the ugly because in the end everything is ugly and so on, and ultimately everything dies and it's all skulls and such. But then that's the kind of art that gets made. Today it's largely promoted and the other kind isn't, because that's just the spirit of the times.
But then again, that's also quite understandable.
If you only look at it from the outside, but art and language have this symbolic meaning, this symbolism, the expression of the content in an appropriate form, and indeed the divine order, the spiritually uplifting content where people connect with the source and then feel strengthened and reminded of their true calling, that would naturally be the original meaning of art.
But we agree that language, ultimately through words, through spoken language, truly gains a completely different momentum, a completely different energy than if you just read it, right?
Yes.
That means you should actually read the Seelenwegbilder and also your other own poetic works, perhaps even once, so they can gain a different power again.
Yes, I've already done that in a small group. We had the book launch a few weeks ago in Zurich, and there were, 60 people and so on. Many just came because we hadn't seen each other for a long time, and not so much because of the poems themselves. And we were then quite surprised that they could actually connect with the poems and the ideas expressed within them, and even feel a certain resonance. For some, it was truly the very first time that they had ever come into contact with this kind of poetry and language. And it is indeed comprehensible. So the language in its very nature is quite understandable and comprehensible, and it also possesses a certain metaphysical background and a fundamental reason that it finds its expression precisely in this non-everyday, non-prosaic form of language. People would sometimes say yes, to put it quite prosaically, I don't feel like it. So in a way, everything was just so prosaic. And then at some point, there finally emerges the non-prosaic language. How does this non-prosaic language actually sound? That's the one that is yes, one might almost call it the sacred language. Just as there is sacred geometry, there is also a sacred language where form and content truly correspond. But holy just sounds so antiquated today, yet in its true sacred sense, that word is what serves healing and wholeness. Holy, holos, wholeness. Then of course one can understand why art can certainly be holy in that sense, or rather should be holy, otherwise it's not really art. Otherwise it's, an expression of personal frustrations and depressions and such things. It certainly serves a therapeutic purpose, but it shouldn't necessarily be put on public display, but rather be privately managed.
Yes, indeed.
What I also find very fascinating, however, is that precisely these poetic works, they actually
to some extent, test the consciousness, the awareness of every single person. This means, on the one hand, you can simply read the text as it is, just like we used to do in school, and perhaps just recite it mechanically without attributing any meaning to it. But you can also feel the deeper and even energetic meaning once you have formed the word. That is then a higher level of perception. And I believe we are all in agreement that poetry, or perhaps more accurately, the manner in which a society communicates, is certainly an indicator of its level of consciousness or its awareness, wouldn't you say? How do you see that?
Yes, absolutely.
We speak the way we think, don't we? And the more undifferentiated, the more unrefined our speech becomes, the more undifferentiated our thinking is, and often very emotionally charged. Or what? You just don't have that inner sanctuary anymore, if you so. If one is always emotionally pulled in one direction or another, if one is emotionally torn back and forth, then one lacks that inner distance, and also one cannot rise above it. One is always reacting, constantly in a state of response. Something comes from the outside, and one immediately gives a reaction in return. You can see it today in politics, business, and everywhere, how poor the culture of conversation has become, right? Everyone wants to speak themselves. No one truly listens. Everyone talks right over the other. This might be a bit negative. Perhaps I've only seen the worst examples on YouTube, but one gets the impression that this is almost more the rule than it is the exception.
Yeah, and many people often remark when you simply watch interviews from 30 or 40 years ago on television, and beneath the YouTube videos, it's always commented how truly incredible the discussions were that were still being conducted back then. One individual genuinely listened to the other.
These are, interviews with Max Friedrich Dürrenmatt or Heinrich Böll and so on, or just simply different ones, so they're not so...
where the reporter asks critical questions and then lets the other person finish speaking, follows up, and so on, and not... That was simple, yes, and it's quite obvious to everyone that back then there was a completely different, one really has to admit, a different standard altogether.
When I look back now, you've studied them. We know that the Celts were very wise, and there are still many, many other examples from the past. Is it really true that humanity is progressing in the sense of truly elevating its consciousness and its awareness? What's your perspective on that?
It is cyclical, and it always comes down to the specific criteria that one chooses to apply. Today, we have the great advantage that we are so deeply immersed in the subject matter here that we perceive things not merely intuitively and clairvoyantly, meaning not just mythically perceive them, but that we can also logically articulate them, because those then become like two strong pillars, for we have seen that simply wasn't necessary in the past. In the past, it wasn't necessary to spell it out, it was simply understood. They say you feel like a fish in water. You don't have to explain to a fish what water is. The H2O, the actual water, is pretty much irrelevant to the fish. He's simply in the water, but if he's no longer in the water, then that's when he realizes, that's where the example ends. But for those of us today who have lost this holistic perception, that's often the case when myth and logos are separated. And that's precisely what happens in this particular era. Myth mutates into mere superstition, and logos mutates into a soulless intellectualism. Today, we can logically formulate the mythical, or as I prefer to say, the spiritual and holistic. And what a wonder, when we approach it that way, we see the spiritual is the most logical thing there is.
When we listen to materialistic explanations, they aren't logical at all, are they? It requires great faith. Today, there are scientists who say, I can no longer be a materialist. I don't have enough faith for that.
And so this is actually the most logical conclusion. And without the spiritual, nothing truly makes sense, not even your own life.
That's why there's just such an abundance of these particular things. Psychotherapy and such is high culture.
because experiencing depression, meaninglessness, burnout, and so on, these are nothing other than symptoms of cries for help from the soul. And but that's the advantage we have today, that we can properly articulate it. And there we don't have to start completely from scratch. We can draw upon what our ancestors have already recognized and understood, and we don't have to turn back time now, back to the Stone Age, although that would also be a rather interesting exercise. But that's not the prevailing notion right now, but rather that we simply integrate the best of the past and the best of the present. Ancient wisdom, modern discoveries, that is the great challenge and also the opportunity of our time.
Yes, but you still need to have an open mind. You need people who are willing to give their attention to it, because there are just so many distractions one can encounter. Do you have the feeling that people are more interested than they used to be? Or is it simply that there are just more people now? So the percentage has remained the same, but in the end, there are still many people. Just not really a significantly increasing amount of interest. What's your take on that?
Yes, every single person is on their own individual journey, and
Experiences life like this.
as is currently the accepted notion, everyone has their own backstory.
Is negative programs and the lessons that one carries with them, and also the talents that one brings along. And I trust
What you're hearing now might be the voice of a somewhat retired missionary.
I was a missionary myself back in my monastic years, but I've simply come to realize by now that one should absolutely trust the spiritual path of people.
Yes, for sure.
Every person is on their own journey and has their
Some much needed spiritual guidance.
And the spiritual guidance, yes, it's on call, so it's always there. And whenever a person is open, impulses to come and synchronicity, and that's why the saying goes, whoever asks, to them it will be given, whoever knocks, to them it will be opened. That is, of course, primarily spiritual. And every person has their phases where you're simply open to new things or somehow doubt a well-trodden path. And that's where the spiritual world always is. That was 50, 100, 200, 5,000, 10,000 years ago. And thankfully, it's still like that today, because as the saying goes, life always happens in the present. Yes.
And hopefully that's done consciously.
And even if not, it will still come to be. It will still develop. Of course, clearly.
Precisely. Everyone is on their own individual path. And from our perspective, the best we can do is simply set an example. As we walk our own path, others will naturally observe it. And if it proves to be relevant for their own lives, it can be an inspiration, a valuable impulse for your own endeavors. And if not, you will receive impulses from elsewhere.
Where did you draw this fundamental trust from? Because that's something you're describing right now. I can absolutely confirm that. But not everyone is born with this primal trust or with this kind of deep trust in the cosmos, in its cosmic processes. Did you always have that?
Whether I always have it, whether I even always have it now, is when I sometimes on YouTube I watch certain kinds of things, or like you mentioned, politics and things of that nature, current affairs and so on.
Then my wife will approach me, not always, but when I've watched something like that, she senses it from my aura, and then she asks, what have you been watching again? Because then I'm emotionally stirred up once more, and I absorb fear or indignation over so much, I don't know what. That really doesn't help anyone, and it's even worse for others. So, but in other words, you can then clearly see it in the aura.
So,
but at least in theory, it's worth the effort to understand. And if the theory proves to be correct, then there's also hope that it will prove correct in practice. So I am now proceeding from the theory, and I'm trying to start from the ideal, and I try to always live up to it, or to constantly readjust myself to it whenever I deviate from it.
I believe it's part of being human that you're not always completely 100% secure in this trust.
yeah, especially when you take a look at certain things, it's really quite something what's going on, and that certainly doesn't leave us unaffected.
I mean that
We are a part of this world. We are both a part of it and not a part. But in the sense that we are a part of it, it doesn't leave us unaffected. And, well, we do have certain ideal expectations. And when those are then so deeply violated, it affects us again, and then we need to realign ourselves.
Let me just briefly share a little something from my personal experience, a small secret from my private life, if you will. I once, from within myself during my meditation or a very profound and deeply immersive meditative experience, I truly came to understand how I formed energy within myself, and how this, through the word, which from my mind, my spirit, my intellect, is ultimately just the medium for an energy, the transmission of that energy, which has formed through me as a vessel, has been shaped into a word. And I truly had this word like a living being, a real energy, an energy, how should I put it? Not a mere lump, but rather an energy field that had formed itself out of me. And it was filled and enriched with the intention, not just with the information, but also with the intention with which I had filled this word. Have you ever had such experiences yourself? Because for me, it was truly profoundly important in my life to genuinely understand the deep meaning of words. I felt it, what that truly signifies. These are not just mere words, they are actual energy fields that we bring into existence.
Everyone has their own very personal mystical experiences. It's as you describe, but I haven't had it in that particular way.
But of course, it is.
And everyone again has their own inner initiations on their path, where initiation, you see, means nothing other than a gate opening. And initiation, that means you initiate something. To initiate is a beginning, simply the start of something new.
Whether it's an insight into a past life or sudden impulses, or in very specific moments, profound inner messages where I knew with absolute clarity, this simply didn't originate from me because these particular words stirred something deep within me, something I truly couldn't have moved or changed by my own strength. Naturally, this always happens precisely at a moment when one truly needs it.
It looks like something is about to arrive.
Where you just know deep down that this pause didn't simply come from the mental levels, pause from your mind that's always chattering on and on.
Because that usually ends up consuming more energy than it actually gives back. So that wasn't its origin. And you simply feel, and it's quite evident, they say there's the masculine way, the feminine way, meaning the brain's two hemispheres, mythos and logos.
So, and then we have the right brain hemisphere. That's the intuitive aspect. That is quite simple. Logos signifies something more profound. What can I truly achieve through my own power? In that state, one is actively engaged and receptive. This implies that if I step back for a moment and become truly receptive, if I switch to a receiving mode, so not always constantly just sending out, but if I allow myself to be open to receiving, then, oh, what a miracle.
Then you find something. Or if the universe was simply just an empty, vast and barren void, not a truly multidimensional, complex cosmos,
it would be crazy if we didn't broadcast. But lo and behold, the most crucial insights in this world, even for inventors, always came via the feminine route. These very scientists ponder and ponder, yet they don't find the solution.
Then just let them go ahead and get into the bathtub or go hiking. And then at some point when they're not even thinking about it,
an idea, an input, an inspiration, and then they understand exactly how they need to go about doing it. But it wasn't an intellectual process at all. In that very moment, it was simply like a download, and that can manifest itself in various different ways.
Are we then, in the final analysis, not simply the vessels for that singular entity which desires to express itself?
So the radiant sun, the many rays of that one sun, or look at your background, we are all rays from the same sun, from the same primal source. And it depends on our attitude and way of thinking how clearly we let this originally pure light shine through us.
But theoretically so, fundamentally and potentially, every human being has the same ability to let this light radiate through themselves
You said that nicely.
Whether it's through words or by some other means. Yes, that's precisely it.
Ultimately, the power of the source forms itself above us and materializes over us. And it does this above all very, very beautifully. And it can also do so very intensely through language.
Yes, that's certainly one of the possibilities. Yes, exactly. We're talking, and it doesn't always have to be so high-flown or, well, high-flown sounds dismissive. So it doesn't always have to be so artistic, but also very simple words. For example, the words I received at a few key moments in my life. Those were very simple words, simple sentences.
That would have been trivial for anyone else. But for me, at that very moment, it was precisely the right thing, with the perfect energy that truly helped me turn a corner and move forward. That is just absolutely individual.
But do we plant the seeds or do they come from somewhere else? I'm still curious about that. How do you see that? So do we truly create or do we merely express?
We really ought to be at least receptive, shouldn't we? Why is it that the physicist, who is constantly discussing physics, suddenly discovers the formula and not me? Yes, because he naturally prepares the field. But the decisive spark comes from elsewhere. And so everyone, each in their own way, we already, in that sense, through our alignment, through our calling, it is primarily through our intention, or perhaps we could say we lay the very foundation. Accordingly, the spiritual world can then work through us. We are not simply just puppets or merely robots, AI robots. In a spiritual sense, they are independent beings. Just as Jesus himself said, I and the Father are one. He didn't actually say, I am the Father. That would be certain Christian doctrines. I am God. No, I and the Father are one. Well, right now he is not the Father, and that is why he is one. So, and he himself says it. If I may just briefly add a Bible footnote. He says Jesus himself then indeed prays there in the farewell speeches. In the Gospel of John, this is described where he prays, I am going now, they remain behind, and I pray that the people who are here are one with you, just as I am one. This meaning that I and the Father are one is not an exclusive elite privilege of Jesus. Jesus prayed that we all would recognize this as well. Exactly. So in that sense, we are co-creators, not merely remote-controlled beams, because each ray in relation to the others is also, how do you say, holographic, and each one is its own unit.
That's very good. Speaking of which, that brings me to my questionnaire. And it actually does also begin with the words I am, so please provide a brief response to that.
So I would say that I am a monad and a divine emanation from God, just like all other beings are.
That's absolutely wonderful. My life motto is...
Well, as for my life's motto, I actually have a very specific one that I live by. It's essentially a concise summary of the Bhagavad Gita. And if I were to put it into very simple, straightforward sentences, it means this. We always strive to do everything that is within our power, and we consistently give our absolute best effort in all that we do. And that truly is what constitutes our own personal sense of perfection.
And our best may not be entirely perfect, but thank goodness that's not the only criterion.
Oh, wow.
He didn't just read that from a script.
No. No one will ask us when we watch our life's film, were you perfect? That's not even a question, but the question will be, did you do your best, honestly?
Yes, and the best part is it's not like that at all. Yes.
All right then. Is there anything in your life that you regret?
Yes. Well, it's actually a very, very small poem that I had written at one point. There's that famous song, you know, Je ne regrette rien, by the legendary Edith Piaf. And that, of course, means I regret absolutely nothing. That's what I wrote. I regret nothing, but I do have regrets.
Yes, all the mistakes one has made, no mistake is predetermined. Karma doesn't predestine actions, but only situations. And in certain situations, I simply acted
things I've done, things I've said, which I later regretted, and which, to the best of my ability, I then either made amends for, or sometimes I just had to let them go. It really depends on the situation. So yes, there are definitely things that one could have handled better. And if you acknowledge them and truly learn from those experiences, that's what matters.
It was, just a part of the whole entire journey. And yes.
Next question. The most profoundly touching moment in my life. I'm sure you've had many such moments in your own life, but please do go ahead and take one.
I remember that special moment when I got married.
The monk? Yes, that's right. The former monk? Yes, him too.
That's really nice. You expressed that so well. That leads us right into this. Love is, what does love mean to you?
Love is the connection to the true and ultimate source. There, where we are two and also one, that is mystical with God, but we can also experience this fractally on all levels, even in our interpersonal relationships, be it marital or simply between people. Everything should actually be born by love. And when I just quoted Jesus from that same context, he says, "Be united among yourselves through love. By this people will know. By this people will recognize that you are my followers."
A very good criterion, a high-level criterion.
Yes, that's right. That's absolutely right.
Love, by the way, also goes hand in hand with awareness. But, well, that's a different topic. I could probably keep talking about this with you for ages. I'm moving on to the second to last question now. If I could play fate for just one day, what would I do? What would you do if you could truly influence how humanity develops?
And if I'm standing right there,
would I really be doing what the spiritual world itself has already prophesied? You see, there are very important prophecies from the spiritual world delivered through various channels, not just Christian ones, but also others.
That it will be a significant turning point or a pivotal moment for the collective, that there will be a soul review, that people will essentially have their entire life's film shown to them without actually dying, that they simply get to see it directly from a higher perspective. What's right and wrong and what needs correcting, and that would be a major change. And if I had my way, I'd just play this film of my soul.
Because it is, after all, already prophesied.
This isn't my arbitrary choice, that's their idea. Then I'd say, okay, go ahead, we need help, we need support. And that would do good if we could also see others' life stories, especially those involved in so much human trafficking and the like. Human trafficking, arms dealing, drug dealing, who walk over thousands of corpses. And yes, if they would just see their film and had a real chance, they'd have no more excuses not to see. Then the course of humanity would collectively change. And Mother Earth would also be happy that her animal and plant children are treated differently by humans, and that her human children would simply interact with love again. And love is not boring, and not just...
Love is not simply a land of ease and plenty, where you don't develop yourself. No, those are truly the most challenging and the greatest trials of whole. But those are exactly what it's all about. And
that's the bottom line.
That is truly one of the most beautiful answers to this question. And that brings me to my final question. I hope the knocking sound here isn't too distracting. My last words for the spine community, that is for our community, should be, do you have anything you would like to share with these people, these listeners, and also viewers all around the world, from your unique perspective, from your work and from your life?
Yes, it's actually just what we've already said. There are no hidden secrets or truths behind the truths. It's quite simple. It is always the same. We are part of the whole, part of the source, and that we truly help to let the light shine into this world. That is why we came here, and that is the most fulfilling and the most beautiful thing.
And then we are independent of what happens in the outside world, because we can always let its light shine through us.
That is also a beautiful answer and very much my core conviction and my motivation why I try to invest so much love, so much strength, time, and energy into connecting people like Armin with you, the searching individuals out there, so that we all grow together even more and become even more visible as a community. For we are not so few, but still everyone is still doing their own thing. And I am very, very grateful to you, Armin, that you are with us and that you support us. And simply because of that, you become accessible to people when they have questions. Their answers can be found in your books, directly from you, in your lectures, and so on.
Well, thank you very much. And I just recently watched your new interview with Thomas Schmelzer on Mystica TV. I can highly recommend it to everyone. That also inspired me a lot. I also had the feeling, I thought sometimes you tend to think you're a little bit alone in this world. But then I said, wow, there are people like Sylvia Leifheit and others out there.
Wow, something is really developing on various levels.
And it is precisely at this point that I can only emphasize spiritually, we are all intrinsically connected, and it is together that we possess the capacity to truly affect change in the external realm. In the rhythm of the many underlying principles and natural laws, numerous different factors are now coming into play. But despite all these complexities, together we can absolutely make a significant impact and bring about meaningful change in the outer world.
Especially when we're together. That's why I truly appreciate so much that we support each other. There's a really, really important key in that. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking part. Thank you for this wonderful interview. I could talk with Armin for ages. I still have so many other questions, but perhaps we can do that another time.
For the time being.
Thank you ever so much. Will we see each other again or a continuation? And many thanks for the platform, for the Spine platform, Spiritual Network. Yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. To each and every one of you.
And I would like to remind you to join our community Spine. We are a community that wants to help you live a healthier life, practice your spirituality, and expand your consciousness. We help you find and connect with healers around the world, and we help you give your life a new meaning in different ways. We are Spine, connections that help.